Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. We have a lot to cover today, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. And so my name is Victor Kwikawa. I'm the Associate Director of Undocumented DACA Student Support, and I'm joined by wonderful colleagues from Cornell Law School, as well as the Division of Public Safety. For context, we have about 400 or so people who registered for this webinar. As of right now, we have 200 people who are joining us. And so because of that, we are going to do our best to answer your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A format on Zoom, as well as save some time for additional questions at the end. As you can imagine, there will be a lot of questions. And so if we did not get to your question, you are more than welcome to message me, Victor at vc356@cornell.edu. And from there, we will try to answer your question after the webinar. For today's webinar, we have three different sections. And so the first section is going to be delivered by faculty from Cornell Law. We're going to be speaking a little bit about just recent developments that have happened as it relates to students on campus. From there, we will transition to my section of the presentation, which is to really just discuss about how this is all impacting students, as well as provide some actionable steps and actions that we can take to be able to support students during this time. And then finally, we will close with a segment from public safety to kind of talk about Cornell specific policies and how CUPD factors into all of this. So with that said, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. And so first we have Professor Jackie Kelly Woodmer, who is a clinical professor of law at Cornell Law School. She founded and directs Cornell's 1L Immigration Law and Advocacy Clinic, and her scholarship focuses on immigration at the intersection of administrative and criminal law. Second, we have Professor Sherry Johnson, who is professor of law at Cornell Law School and teaches constitutional law, criminal law, and the death penalty clinic, leads, I think, the death penalty clinic. And then finally, we have Dave Honan, who is the associate vice president for public safety, a former CUPD officer. And so I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. And so with that said, I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues over at Cornell Law, who will be going over recent developments and how that is playing out for our students.
Great. Thank you so much, Victor. And I think the slides will come up in a moment here so that we can talk through some recent updates in immigration law. So today our goal is to give an overview of a little bit about what's going on in the immigration world at this moment. Today's April 23rd, 2025. And so the information we're giving is as up to date as possible, but we want to remind everyone that things are changing quickly, as you probably know. And so, keep following the news, and we'll provide further updates down the line as we can. Today, I'm going to talk through some of the issues going on for students and other members of our international community. We'll talk through some Know Your Rights, and my colleague Sherry will talk about some of your precautions while traveling before we turn it back over to Victor. I just want to note here that, as Victor mentioned, Sherry and I are professors in the clinical program at Cornell Law School, and this means that we are professors in a teaching clinic. And so while we are happy to talk with you about all of this, and we often speak with students on campus, we are not a full service law firm. And if you have questions as an international student or scholar, you should first ask the legal team at the Office of Global Learning. So with that, I'll turn to the next slide just to give an overview about the expanded enforcement that's going on in immigration right now. As you know, there have been many executive orders starting in January that target different programs and populations. I won't go over all of them now. Some of our prior webinars have touched on some of those executive orders, but we have seen them typically really targeting certain kinds of immigrant communities as well as legal services providers for those communities. And new executive orders are coming out frequently. Another trend in the Trump administration has been increased partnerships between ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and local law enforcement. That has been nationwide. And I know many of our international scholars and students and many of our community members may have family members who live in other states. So just so you know, although we are in Ithaca, where it's a sanctuary city and there's not cooperation between our local law enforcement and ICE, in some places throughout the country, we're seeing increased partnership, meaning that local law enforcement will help ICE with detaining or finding immigrants that they're interested in. We also are seeing expanded expedited removal, which is an extra fast removal process that can happen for people who have been in the US for less than 2 years and don't have lawful status. And you may have heard about the alien registration requirement, which went into effect less than 2 weeks ago. Most people who have a student visa or other kind of lawful status or work permit are already registered, but this is a new system that this administration has put in place to try and require everyone who is in the US and is not a citizen to have registered. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I suggest that you look into other resources about it. In addition, we've seen that there have been deportations under the Alien Enemies Act recently, and I just am touching on these things sort of at a high level to acknowledge that these things are happening. And so here we have seen that there's been these deportations, and they have been currently paused by the Supreme Court just as of a few days ago. So that's some of the big picture trends around enforcement. On the next slide, I want to talk about student visa issues. So starting earlier this month, we started to see wider scale revocation of student visas. Around March, we saw some revocations and some targeting for immigration enforcement for student activists, those who had been connected to certain political opinions, who had been involved in certain campus protests or writing op-eds, things like that. People who had been involved in those activities were being targeted for enforcement. But since then, in April, we started to see nationwide revocations in the SEVIS system, which is the student visa system. And these revocations of student visas were happening and are happening for reasons that are really unclear. In talking with folks nationwide, it seems like the revocations are caused by any kind of interaction with law enforcement or appearing in a criminal database for any reason, even if it's a small thing like a suspended license, and even if it's from a long time ago. It's even been sometimes for people who have been the victim of a crime, and that's why they are in a database. What I'll say about this is it started happening a few weeks ago, and we see at least 2,000 now, but there are more coming, and there has been some real response by the immigration bar to try and figure out how to help people who are just here studying and trying to complete their degrees and are worried about their suspended or revoked student visa. We are seeing some success in lawsuits challenging that. And so if your student visa is revoked or you're worried about it, you should reach out to the Global Learning Office because they are monitoring this situation. There have been a few of these revocations at Cornell, but a very, very small percentage. I also just wanted to note that because we're seeing these kinds of revocations that sometimes are related to politics and sometimes are not, we know that the administration is using AI and other tools to scrutinize social media accounts. And so you might consider, if you're an international student or scholar, consider your social media accounts and decide what you want to keep posted there in case you think that you're at risk of revocation for anything political that might be going on. To the next slide. Another issue that we're seeing that's impacting people on campus is impacts on humanitarian programs. And I didn't even list asylum here, but of course, asylum is one of the main humanitarian programs. And Right now, what we're seeing is there's several other types of programs that have been used during the Biden administration, and many of them also prior to the Biden administration, that allowed people in vulnerable situations to come to the US or to stay in the US for a temporary period of time, usually 2 years. And so for temporary protected status, that's for countries, there are several different countries that are eligible for temporary protected status, and the administration has been shortening the validity period for those countries, like Haiti, for example. We also have seen that the parole program for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela has been targeted. And so the administration said they would be ending this program effective tomorrow, actually, April 24th. But litigation has stopped that revocation, at least for the moment. And so we actually presented just about a month ago and brought this up. And since then, the revocation of parole has been enjoined, which just means paused. It could still be revoked, but for the moment, people on CHNB parole continue to have work authorization. I bring all this up because I know that there are people that are part of the Cornell community that are on these different kinds of statuses, and they are working on campus and are members of our community, and we want to be aware of the different impacts that are happening for them as well. We've seen rescission of parole for people who came in at the border under Biden on the CBP-1 app, which was an app that allowed people to basically ask for asylum in an orderly, organized way, and then enter to have their immigration hearings within the US. But everybody who came in on that is mostly still waiting for their hearings, and we are seeing some revocation of that parole. We also are thinking about our DACA recipients on campus. DACA recipients can continue to renew their DACA and should do so on time in a timely manner, which is about 5 or 6 months before their DACA expires. And DACA recipients can continue to apply for advanced parole, but we are seeing some changes in advanced parole. And so if you decide to do that, definitely come talk to me. I do work with DACA recipients, and we'll be happy to advise you about that. Next slide, please. So in these times when we are seeing a lot of quick changing situations for our immigration and international community, and we are not sure what exactly our administration is going to do next or what the enforcement might look like, it's really important to know your rights, to inform yourself and your close contacts, the people who are around you, your family members, your roommates. Inform yourself about your constitutional rights and how you could exercise them. We have presented on Know Your Rights previously on our other webinar series, and there is a link which I can put later in the Q&A to a longer form Know Your Rights PowerPoint that I developed with the clinical program here at Cornell Law School that gives more detail about how you might exercise your rights. But for now, we'll do an overview so that you know that in any given interaction you might have with ICE, you will decide how to respond and which rights you want to exercise depending on the situation and your personal circumstances. So to the next slide. This slide shows your basic constitutional rights that we want to talk about today, the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and the Sixth Amendment. And I've excerpted the actual Constitution here. And so the Fourth Amendment provides protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. That basically means you can't be searched or arrested without a warrant or probable cause. The Fifth Amendment allows you to remain silent when you are speaking with law enforcement or to decline to speak with law enforcement. And the Sixth Amendment is the right to counsel. So to the next slide, we have sort of broken this down a little bit. How can you exercise those rights if you want to? If you are encountering law enforcement, and particularly ICE, of course, you can use these phrases to exercise any of your rights. For example, you can say, I do not consent to a search, or I do not consent to you entering my home. If you are encountering ICE and you don't want to speak about your immigration situation or answer questions, you can say, I do not wish to speak to you. It's best to actually say that rather than simply not speaking. And note that you can you can decline to continue answering questions at any time if you wish to, even if you've already answered some questions. You have the right to counsel, and you can say, I will not speak to you without a lawyer. And importantly, I will not sign anything without speaking to a lawyer. It's really important if you do have any concerns about your immigration status to consider whether it's in your best interest to show your documents and explain your immigration status, or is it better for you, because of your situation, to decline to answer questions and instead speak to a lawyer? The baseline, though, is that you can always ask, am I free to go? Because if you encounter ICE when you're walking on campus or you're on the commons, there may not be any reason for ICE to stop you and speak with you. And we have seen sometimes that rather ICE will sort of indiscriminately stop people and speak to them in some scenarios. And so importantly, first question, am I free to go? That is a way that you may be able to calmly and peacefully end an encounter if you wish to. I also want to note that you should never lie or present false documents in this scenario. Either decline to answer questions or answer questions truthfully, but do not lie or present false documents. Next, I want to show you the two types of warrants that you might encounter, because your rights, especially under the Fourth Amendment, are protected by the need to have a warrant or probable cause. This means that if ICE arrives to your workplace or your home and they're seeking a specific person and they want to come in to search the space to make an arrest, you can say no, because under the Fourth Amendment, you have the right to decline. And if you do give consent to an officer, then they can enter. So if you give consent, they can enter your home or private area. But if you don't give consent, the only way that they can enter is with a judicial warrant. However, ICE will often have their own warrant, which essentially is an administrative document that explains to ICE what they should do. And so you can see on this slide that we have put an ICE warrant and a judicial warrant side by side so that you can compare the two. An ICE warrant is going to have the Department of Homeland Security across the top and be directed to any immigration officer. It will not list as specifically as the warrant will the time, place, or manner of the thing to be searched or who is going to be arrested. And it will be signed by an immigration officer. I know the text here is very tiny, but there are some other resources we can put in the chat later that are links to different kinds of warrants. But you can also look for the National Immigration Law Center warrant guide. The judicial warrant will have the name of a judicial court at the top. Here, United States District Court. It could be a magistrate court. It will be some kind of court, though, not the Department of Homeland Security. And it will not be directed to an immigration officer, but instead to any authorized law enforcement officer. And this will specify exactly the time, place, and manner of search more specifically, and will have an original judge's signature. So if ICE is at your door, you can say, I do not consent to your entry. I would like to see your warrant. You can have them put the warrant under the door or hold it up. But if it's not a judicial warrant, you can decline to allow them to enter. Next slide. This is the last one for me, mentioning what your rights are on campus. As you're probably thinking, well, when do I ask them for a warrant, or how do I know whether I can decline consent? If you are in a public space or a private space, your rights are different. So in a public space, or it can play out differently. In a public space, that's an area that any person could be in anytime, right? It's public, it's open. ICE can come in there without permission. Versus a private space where ICE or other law enforcement need that consent or warrant to enter. And so if you think about this, a public space, for example, if you're in a restaurant, anyone can walk into the restaurant, they can go in the dining room, they can sit in that space, and ICE could be there too. As opposed to a private space like the kitchen of the restaurant, the general public generally can't just walk back there. Here on campus, we think about how dorm rooms or private offices, like your professor's offices. These are going to be private spaces, and ICE will need that judicial warrant. Sometimes it's unclear whether a space is public or private. And in fact, I think that Dave Honan is going to talk more about this later on. So I'll leave it there for now. But the public versus private spaces is where you may encounter ICE in public, and in private, you can decline to allow folks to enter unless they have a warrant or consent. Now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Johnson.
My next slide, please. So I should start by saying I don't really know anything about immigration, or rather everything I know I've learned very recently. But the reason that I have something to say, or maybe have something to say to this presentation, is that criminal procedure is an area with which I'm very familiar. So most of what I have to say is little quibbles about criminal procedure law and things that might be helpful in figuring out how they apply to immigration situations. And with that in mind, I want to add, not correct, but add a couple of things to what Jackie said. So the first thing I wanted to say about not the right to remain silent is people often have the misconception that it doesn't matter if the police officer didn't give you your Miranda rights, then if you say something, it can't be used against you. That's not true, or it's often not true. And so in most situations, at least casual encounters, there is no need for you to get your Miranda rights. So yes, it's important to know whether you got them or not, but don't feel like you're free to say whatever you like to say because no one gave you your Miranda rights. Also, I will say, related to not speaking, if you're a citizen and you've done nothing wrong, you might consider saying, I don't wish to speak with you, just to support the people around you who also may need to refuse to speak. I'm not saying about, if someone's investigating a murder, I'm not talking about that, but if you see ICE, you do not have an obligation to speak to ICE at all. So, I think it's important that you could want to, but you certainly don't have to, and there are reasons not to do that. And the last little quibble is, regarding someone entering your home or your business, you can actually a warrant or consent or an emergency. So just so you know, if there is an emergency, like someone inside is in danger, then you can have an entry without that. And you're not going to know whether that's true or not. So I don't think Jackie is suggesting that you would resist if there is no warrant, but only that you need to know that consent is a reason, even if they had absolutely no cause. And so, you have no reason to give consent, and under most circumstances, it would not be wise to do that. So let me talk a little bit about your rights and precautions to take while you're traveling. So one thing to know is that the rights that we often associate with being in a free country, the Fourth Amendment rights, the Fifth Amendment rights, those are modified at the border. And so you can be subject to a secondary inspection based on facts that are not necessarily of indicating you've done something right. So Customs and Border Patrol says they can search all devices and bags without any suspicion that you have done something wrong if you are entering the country. And so you can quibble with some of that, maybe with your computer, but at the very least, you are likely to be delayed, and you want to think about whether or not that's what you want to do. Next slide, please. And Victor just sent me something saying, hurry up, so I'll hurry up. So your rights in a secondary inspection do depend on whether you're a United States citizen, a green card holder, or LPR, and others. So basically, as a citizen, all you need to do is establish your identity and citizenship, and you do not have an obligation to answer anything more. If you're a lawful permanent resident, then you have to establish your identity and your permanent residency. And other things you're not supposed to have to answer, but in fact, not answering might lead to delays. Others, though, if you're not a lawful permanent resident or a citizen, if you don't answer questions, you are likely to be delayed, and that's that's permissible. I'm going to say, and this is maybe ultra conservative about this, if you're not an American citizen, I would consider not traveling unless you really, really have to, because what will happen at the border is much less subject to control than it is any place else. And particularly that's true if you have any kind of red flags at all in your immigration history. I would say you need to talk to a lawyer before you travel. Next slide, please. Also, if you are at the border, you want to, if anyone does take anything of yours, note down who took it, when they took it, their name, ask for a receipt. And while it's true that they're not supposed to pull you aside based on your race, religion, or ethnicity alone, they might do that. And the problem is that you're not going to know whether it's race or religion alone. So it's worth observing who else is pulled over, but that's about all that you can do at that point. Next slide, please. So in a car, I guess I have to talk even faster yet. You can be stopped for reasonable suspicion, not for probable cause, and reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot, meaning it doesn't even necessarily have to have happened yet. You generally can't tell whether officers have reasonable suspicion or not, and they don't have to tell you the basis for thinking that. If you are stopped and you're the driver, you have to produce your license. If you're not the driver, unless there is reason to be particularly suspicious of you having engaged in a crime, you don't have to provide any kind of license or other identification. Of course, there might be a reason to be suspicious of you, but if there's not, just being a passenger in a car that's stopped is not a sufficient reason. The rules about car searches are really complicated. The main thing to know, I think, is don't consent to a search of your car. I mean, there's really no benefit to doing that, and I'm going to say I have had students who have had stuff planted in the course of a search of your car. I see no reason to do that, unless you're afraid for your physical safety if you refuse to consent. I wouldn't volunteer any information beyond my identity, and I would only do that if I were told I was not free to go. But don't lie, because lying is a separate offense, and so you don't want to do that under any circumstances. You can refuse to say anything. Next slide. Buses and trains, I'll just say really quickly, they can board a bus and block the entry off a bus and don't have to tell you that you don't have to answer questions, but you don't have to answer questions unless they have individualized suspicion. It's noteworthy in choosing between Amtrak and Greyhound that Amtrak announces on its website that it allows ICE on trains to conduct searches even when there's no individualized suspicion, and Greyhound says that it doesn't do that unless ICE has a judicial warrant. Next slide. So these are some general precautions. Monitor news, take proof of your lawful status in the United States, carry hard copies. You may really want to think about letting people know where you're going to be, so that if you do disappear, and there was something recently in the news about someone who just disappeared, you want someone to know where you're supposed to have been. And there was a question in the chat about that. I think having faculty can suggest to students that they give people information about where they're going to be and when. You might think about deleting information off your phone, and you might want to memorize the number of an emergency contact so that you can call if an issue does arise. Next slide. The only other thing I wanted to notice is if you have a non-citizen student who is charged with a Cornell offense or a crime of any sort, even a misdemeanor, or thinks they might be charged in the future, I would really urge them to reach out to the Respondents Codes Counselor's Office. I'm actually the advisor to the Respondents Codes Counselor's Office. They give students advice about avoiding attention and avoiding charges. And so you don't have to wait to do that until charges are brought. And as Jackie noted, even though the charges might not be serious at all, ICE has been looking for people with conduct charges at universities and misdemeanors. So if anything like that is about to happen, it's risky, and consulting the respondent's code counsel as well as a lawyer is a good idea. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Sherry, for sharing that information. This was asked in the chat, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of this. I know that there's a lot of information that we're covering, and so this presentation will be recorded and it will be shared. So in this section, I'm really going to be talking about what are some of the ways in which students are navigating this new reality, and then also what are some ways in which we can support students across the university. And so on the next slide, the thing that is really important for us to understand is really the breadth of this issue. So this map is taken from a portal from Inside Higher Education that actually visualizes the different visa revocations across the US and the number of students who have had their visas revoked in different universities, state by state, across the country. As you can see, this is not just a private school issue. This is not just an IB issue. This is not just an East Coast issue. This is really a national issue. And so I say that because it's really important for us to be able to understand that this is the reality that our students are facing. I made a quip in recent presentations, and it similarly applies here. This map is accurate as of today. It is likely to grow. And it's important for us to understand that this is something that is only going to keep happening throughout the rest of the Trump administration. On the next slide, what we're going to be looking at are just what are the developments and who is actually being affected by this. So at Cornell, we've started talking about students with vulnerable immigration status, meaning students who have TPS, refugees, students who are seeking asylum, as well as students who are undocumented, as well as DACA. Now, in addition to students with vulnerable immigration status, those who are also navigating this new reality are those with formal immigration status. So legal permanent residents, students on F1, J1 visas. And so as of today, as of this morning, over 270 colleges and universities have identified about 1,730 plus international students and recent graduates who have had their legal status changed by the State Department as of today. Now, one thing to really keep in mind about this is that this really underscores something that is going to be happening during the rest of the Trump administration, which is that immigration status is not fixed. It's quite the opposite. It's very fragile. And so that fragility for immigration status has caused our students to face significant obstacles as well as their families. So as we've talked about previously, we've seen the suspension of certain immigration programs through which our students have been allowed to be here. Certain individuals who have begun processing their green card applications have actually had that paused as the administration looks to carry out more strict vetting. We've seen increased scrutiny at ports of entry, both along the US border, but also in airports. And then one thing to also keep in mind is that in many of the cases in which students are having their visas revoked, they are being provided unclear justification, if any justification at all. Now, on the next slide, I really want to be able to just talk about how this has actually affected the student experience. Now, as you can imagine, the increased stress, as well as the anxiety of ongoing, as well as upcoming immigration developments have actively presented barriers in our students' education. Now, this isn't to say that every single student who might fall under this this new wave of changes is stressed or anxious 100%. I certainly don't want to communicate that because students are choosing to navigate this in different ways. So some are choosing to focus on their studies. I've always been really impressed and really heartened by the resilience of our students, but across the board, this has led to some increased stress and anxiety because these recent immigration changes have had effects on personal, academic, as well as professional plans. As you can imagine, some of our students have had to reconsider their travel plans. I received a question in the chat that talked about whether certain students should be discouraged from flying at all, right? And that is a decision that I think really depends on the individual student's case, and it's important that he or she consult with an attorney. Students are also having to face the very real prospect of developing emergency plans for what happens if they are detained or what happens if they voluntarily choose to leave the country. Now, not all recent developments are a distinct byproduct of this administration. So Real ID is something that's going to be rolling out May 7th. It's something that's been on the books for a while, and it's going to restrict the ability of undocumented students, for example, to be able to travel on domestic flights. And so one thing to keep in mind is that these psychological and these emotional stressors can limit the degree to which students seek support from us, because as you can imagine, discussing one's immigration status can be a very vulnerable point for students. And so it's really important for us to be able to be intentional about doing that engagement and creating spaces for students to be able to talk about this reality with us in a safe space. And then finally, one thing that I really want to underscore is that the student experience is ultimately tied to and affected by the immigration status or lack thereof of family members. So as many of you all know, here at Cornell, we have many, many mixed status students, meaning these are students who perhaps might have been born in the US, but whose parents or whose relatives have differing immigration statuses. There was a particularly tragic case that came out of Texas a couple of weeks ago, a little bit over 2 months ago, in which a 11-year-old child actually made the difficult decision to end her life because of the bullying that she faced as a result of the new political landscape in which we find ourselves, and the fact that her parents were undocumented. Next slide, please. So in terms of how to support students, I really want to emphasize that supporting students really involves operating on two different levels. So number one, focusing on supporting students on the interpersonal level, but also recognizing that it's important for us to think about these more structural changes or ways in which we might be able to support students. Doing so is going to essentially be able to support not only their mental health, their well-being, but also help foster an increased sense of community and belonging to this campus. And then it's also important to think about the fact that supporting students requires ongoing reflection and attention, meaning that it is important for us to really just stay abreast of things that are going on and be able to act accordingly as we figure out how they're affecting our students. Now, one final thing that I want to say about the importance of supporting students is that at the end of the day, supporting students with vulnerable immigration status is an extension of the commitment that we made to admitting these students and ensuring that they're able to have the most productive 4 years of their time here at Cornell. Now, on the next slides, what I'm really going to go over are just some steps that we can take. Now, as you can imagine, with almost 300 participants, we have people from all across campus in many different positions, and some of these might be a little bit more relevant than others, but I nonetheless want to make sure that you leave having something in your toolkit to be able to support students in your individual capacity, as well as through the department or division in which you work. So the first thing is to really just consider how to go about engaging individuals with whom you have an existing relationship who might be affected by this. As some of you know, I myself am a DACA recipient. And so something that has been incredibly heartening for me as I go about doing this work is colleagues, friends, reaching out to me and just checking in to see how I'm doing. And so similarly, students have communicated to me that that is something that they look for. So it's important to just make sure that we can check in on those who might be affected by everything that's going on. It's similarly important to, at a larger level, just really think about cultivating a environment in which students feel a sense of belonging. And so we might be able to do that through intentional communication, engagements, programming that acknowledges what the current situation is, because students are really looking for any sort of messaging, any sort of guidance, and any sort of communication that different members of the university community really understand the severity of what is happening. There is actually a resource that is meant to be able to help faculty and staff navigate potential site visits by external law enforcement. That is available on a Cornell webpage, and I'm happy to share that with you all in the chat. In terms of academics, as you can imagine, students' academic experience is something that is being affected by all of this. And so it's really important to start thinking about different forms of academic considerations and even leniency in light of the shifting immigration landscape. And with professors in particular, it's important that professors are able to communicate to students that these are some things that might be available to them in their class. And so, for example, I was working with a student fairly recently who mentioned to me that she had not been able to go to class in 2 weeks and that she was afraid of how to bring up that conversation with her professor because she wasn't quite sure how he would respond to the reality of what she was facing. So it's important to just be able to make the offer in some ways before students feel the need to reach out. On the next slide, we're going to go into some other ways into kind of thinking about how to support students. And so it's really important to think about developing protocols for how students can fulfill their academic obligations if they are detained or, in the worst possible case, removed from the country. On that note, it's important to identify resources to support students who might not be able to travel home during academic breaks as a result of what's going on. And so emergency housing, emergency storage are some things that would be good to think about for students. It's similarly important to develop a departmental or divisional task force to really think about how to support students with vulnerable immigration status in your specific work of in the specific work that you do at the university. And then it's also important to, as I mentioned before, really just stay atop everything that is going on to better understand the relevant impact that this is having within your unit or division so that you can then make the necessary changes to existing policy. Finally, some things to kind of think about are developing mental health resources that engage with the student experience of those with vulnerable immigration status. Students' mental and emotional well-being is something that is being affected by everything that's going on. And so it's important to start thinking about what mental health resources might be available to help students navigate these times. At Cornell, we actually are very fortunate in the sense that we have partnered with a local immigration law firm called Miller Mayer, who is one of the different legal resources that exist for students. More information can be found on the URL below. But essentially, students are able to book an initial consultation to receive some initial guidance on their respective situation. It's important to really think about reconsidering travel requirements for students with vulnerable immigration status. And by that, I mean study abroad, revisiting the issue of whether a student needs to be able to leave the country to be able to fulfill some form of academic obligations. In the case that a student visa is revoked, it's imperative that the student or a faculty member who is aware of that revocation contact Cornell International Services. The URL is below. And then finally, I myself am always happy to be a resource to help you navigate the situation. I've been very fortunate to work with different colleagues, different partners throughout the last couple of weeks to provide more tailored and individualized guidance on how to be able to support students through this. And so it's important to maybe think about identifying an individual who can serve as a liaison to my office and work together on future programming that can perhaps provide some more individualized suggestions for you all as all of this unfolds.
If I
On
could
the
add
next slide,
sorry. I was just going to add one little thing about what professors can do to what you said, which is that you said that, you don't want to wait until a student asks you. But I think it's actually very valuable if you say at the beginning of a class or whenever, say to everyone in the class, your openness to those students who are struggling with immigration issues, because students you may not know who needs those accommodations. And it's like a religious accommodation. It's better to say, let me know if there's a holiday that you're celebrating rather than wait for people to come to you.
Yeah, sure. That's an excellent point. And so, as Sherry mentioned, it is important about communicating that verbally, right? So that students are able to have the opportunity through which to engage, right? Rather than waiting for them to be able to go to you. Now, some of these resources I've posted in the chat, right? Because I know that we all might not be familiar with these different organizations, but these are some relevant resources to really help you navigate the different areas of need that our students might be facing. So the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration is an incredible resource. It has several different documents, several different pages to provide further guidance on some of the things that we've talked about today. The university has a website to provide guidance and information on ongoing executive orders. The National Immigration Law Center has just an incredible wealth of resources to help further explained to individuals what their rights are in relation to everything that's going on. And then in the worst case scenario, how to potentially find a loved one after an immigration arrest. They also have really good resources on how to develop emergency plans as students kind of navigate the possibility of visa revocation or being removed from the country. The higher ed immigration portal has similarly a wealth of resources for different students with vulnerable immigration status. And then finally, Inside Higher Education has a portal that I mentioned earlier through which you can kind of track the visa revocations as they are popping up throughout colleges and universities in the United States. And so with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dave, who's going to be talking a little bit about public safety, CUPD, and where they kind of factor into all of this.
Great. Thanks, Victor. I appreciate the invite and the opportunity to talk with everybody. Again, I'm Dave Honan. I'm the Associate Vice President for Public Safety here at Cornell. And I want to just lead, I know you wanted me to talk a lot about CUPD, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But there's a lot more to public safety than just CUPD. So I want to make sure everybody's aware that public safety includes the Public Safety Communications, or our 911 Center, our Public Safety Ambassadors, which is an unarmed, non-sworn, non-enforcement team, Community Response Team, which is our own mobile crisis response team to help people in crisis, Access Control, which makes sure our card access works, Clarity Compliance, make sure we're being transparent about crimes that happen on campus, and we alert people to dangers on campus. We have a student-run, all-volunteer EMS crew, so CUEMS is a valuable resource here at Cornell. And emergency management, and I always got to put a plug in for emergency.cornell.edu to look on that website. Gives you there's an area called the Emergency Action Guide. Gives you some tips as to what to do in various emergencies on campus. So there's much more of that, but then there is CUPD. Next slide, please. So a question that I commonly get is, what is CUPD's jurisdiction? So CUPD has jurisdiction on Cornell property and adjoining roadways, even if they're public roadways or municipal-owned roadways. CUPD has jurisdiction if they adjoin Cornell property. One important fact is, off campus or off of those adjoining roadways, CUPD can only act in felonies that occur in their residence, but they can also provide some general assistance. So if a local agency has a traffic accident and they need assistance with traffic control, or more and more, we've built a good relationship so that if we have a Cornell affiliated person who's a victim of crime and needs extra assistance, local agencies will contact CUPD to help get that person put into our victims assistance programs here at the university. CUPD is required to abide by all federal, state, county, and city laws. And as Jackie talked about earlier, we have a county and a state that has sanctuary city policies that we have to abide by. Next slide, please. Public safety, I talked earlier about all the other units we have. So of those units, the Public Safety Ambassadors, Community Response Team, and Communications are the frontline first responders. And through our reimagining efforts, we've worked to try to have these folks answer some calls we just don't need police officers handling, especially folks in crisis and for basic security functions. These divisions all have strict policies prohibiting collection, sharing, and storing of immigration or citizenship information. Next slide, please. Generally for the university, we will not release information without a subpoena or a judicial warrant or as otherwise required by a law. Our campus protocol on the website that Victor had shown is to give a call to the Public Safety Communications Center and ask for a CUPD officer to respond if ICE is on campus. And we can have an officer respond and verify that person is actually who they say they are. And if they are, we can ask them to produce valid warrants versus the administrative warrants that we talked about earlier. And we will only honor judicial warrants. We'd ask that you don't answer any questions, but just politely inform anybody that's asking that only CUPD or our general counsel can speak to. Don't interfere with anything they're doing and remain calm. But please, I just reiterate, call us and let us be the ones to have an officer engage with any federal officers. The easiest way to get a hold of us is the 255-1111, or use the Rave Guardian app. If you download the Rave Guardian app, you can, besides hitting a button to connect with our Public Safety Communication Center, you can actually text us. And if you're concerned about identity, you can actually text us anonymously on that Rave Guardian app. So no matter where you are on Cornell property, if it's a private space or even it's one of our open spaces on campus, as long as it's on our campus, give us a call and we'll have somebody respond. I get a lot of questions about what is the CUPD policy when dealing with immigration issues. That website right there, Victor, I don't know if you can put that in the chat. That links right to the CUPD policy. So you can see exactly what CUPD can and cannot do when it comes to these matters. Next slide, please. So, as we've talked about earlier, don't lie. That is a whole separate charge if you're dealing with a federal agent and you lie to them. And the phrases here are recommended that you use, and just speak calmly and just be matter of fact that you're not authorized to answer questions or review any legal documents, and defer to the Cornell police or call a supervisor. We would rather have our law enforcement talking to federal law enforcement, and we can press them for the appropriate paperwork and reiterate where they can and cannot be if it's private or public space on campus. And there's, as Victor had put in earlier, the website to the Cornell info on dealing with this. Next slide, please. So when you click, and if you look into the CUPD policy on this, you're going to see this. It's clear that CUPD are not authorized to enforce immigration laws. We do have training on how to handle, and we've had our friends at the law school come down and help provide us some supportive training. And we do train when we get a new officer in that maybe didn't get this level of training in the police academy. We train them on how to tell the difference between an administrative warrant and an actual judicial warrant. If there is a judicial warrant, we have to follow law and we cannot obstruct the execution of that warrant, but we're also not going to participate. We cannot execute warrants. So that is explicit in our law, and that's explicit in our status as peace officers. A lawful subpoena, we will redirect that person over to counsel's office. Please, if they come to your office, if they come and ask you for documents, we do this every day for a lot of different reasons. When there's a subpoena served on an employee or a staff member or on the university in general, that all gets redirected to counsel's office, and we will help them find their way over there and speak to somebody from that office. We'll also handle bad actors accordingly. And when I say that, I'm talking about somebody who may try to impersonate an immigration officer or somebody trying to target members of our community based on race, gender, ethnicities. Please call us. We want to verify if they say they are a law enforcement, if they say they're an immigration or a federal officer. We want to verify they are who they say they are and then get them to the right place. But if they're not, we will certainly handle that accordingly. Next slide. CUPD does not collect, store, or share immigration information. We also do not collect, store, or share citizenship information in most cases, and there are some exceptions. And those exceptions are if a student or anyone on campus is arrested for a serious crime, or if they're missing, seriously injured or deceased. And why we do that is there are federal laws and international laws that require, if you are a citizen of a, they call it designated country, we are required to notify that person's embassy that they are either arrested, missing, seriously injured. And that allows the embassy to provide resources to that person. I did put a link in there, Victor. I don't know if you can put that link in the chat or if this will be shared later, but that is from the State Department describing what the process is for consular notification. Now, there are other, if a foreign national is arrested for a serious crime, and by serious crime, I mean a crime where you're going to be fingerprinted, photographed, not a traffic ticket or a violation level offense. We will ask them if they want their embassy notified. If they're not on the mandatory list, it is their choice whether we notify their embassy that they've been arrested or not. We honor those requests. Next slide, please. Public and private spaces, again, the campus, we have a very open campus here. So public spaces that are open to anyone are open to anyone, including a federal agent if they are visiting campus. Private spaces with restricted access, we can assist if unauthorized individuals attempt to enter or have entered and then refuse to leave. That would be another reason to give us a call, and we could enforce that that's private space absent a judicial warrant. And something unique, it's something that's wonderful about Cornell is we're a very open campus. We have a lot of spaces open to the public and a lot of people can come and go. There's a lot of difference between us and more urban campuses that have card access, card swipes, where you can't enter unless you go through a turnstile, or where you can't even have guests in buildings unless you do a formal registration process. We don't have that here at Cornell. So that is a gap that we have where we can't always just close the campus off. But I think it's important to, as we discussed earlier, if you have a private office, just post a sign that it is private. Next slide, please. That's it. Thank you, Victor.
So thank you, Dave. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Sherry. We certainly had a lot to cover, and we have been receiving and doing our best to answer questions throughout this webinar. But I do think that there are some questions that are kind of like worth answering live, just to kind of get all the different presenters' perspectives on this. And then during the segment, you're more than welcome to type in your questions in the chat if you have some questions that you have at the end of this presentation. So the first question that I would like to present to the rest of the presenters is, we have heard conflicting information regarding DACA individuals traveling by air domestically. Thoughts about traveling to locations via plane, like down south. Also, tips about handling facial recognition in these spaces for checking into flights.
Yeah, is this a question to me about what should we do about people traveling? I think that the reason people are seeing conflicting answers about this is that it's been very unpredictable what kind of experience that people have while they're traveling. And so I don't see any reason that someone can't travel with their DACA ID that is an accepted form of travel to use their work authorization document. And that should be an accepted form of travel nationwide. So I have gotten this question before, and I don't have personally any reports of people having challenges using that. I don't know much about how to deal with facial recognition spaces, but maybe Sherry has more on that.
I don't, although I will say one thing about traveling with DACA documents. Right now, that's okay. But I think the really frightening thing has been that the web of people that ICE has been seizing gets ever broader. And so I think with respect to all of this, I would say I would carefully weigh whether I really needed to go, because I just, and like I said, that might be me being more cautious, but in my personal life, with some of my children are naturalized citizens, I don't want them to go anywhere. And so I think you have to make a judgment, but I think no one can tell you that it's necessarily safe. The problem with facial recognition software is that it's actually much worse with people of color. It's much less reliable, but I don't know what you can do about that. I mean, I don't think that there's an obvious answer to that, except, you want to have evidence of who you are and your legal presence here with you all the time. More than that, I really can't say, other than, a good lawyer will actually present evidence that that software is very poor with people of color, and that there have been some really notorious mistakes made.
So just adding on to what was said, if you are DACA, depending on the state from which you are coming, it is likely that your state has been able to issue you a real ID, in which case there shouldn't really be an obstacle. Now, it's a completely different issue if you are undocumented. Now, I know that sometimes DACA and undocumented are used interchangeably, but an undocumented student who does not have DACA, my recommendation has been to really just avoid domestic air travel because of the risk of potential engagement with immigration officials. In terms of facial recognition, what I would say is that it really depends on the airport, I would say, in which you're flying out of. So, for example, in San Diego, you have the option to decline facial recognition and simply present your identification, but again, your experience might look differently depending on what airport you're traveling from. So another question that I think is in the chat that would be good to bring up is there guidance on how to recognize ICE, especially in plain clothes, and best practices to support to protect community members during interactions with ICE on campus?
I'll go ahead and take that one, Victor. I think, if somebody is again saying that they are ICE or you believe they are, and they're presenting them and ask you questions, you can certainly challenge them and ask for ID. But I would still default back to our original call, the Public Safety Communications Center, and ask for an officer to come and vet that person. We have had misidentified people who turned out to be people doing background checks. So I don't want to sound the alarm too early, but I also want to make sure that we're vigilant and we're checking folks out. And if they don't have legitimate business here, we're asking them to move on. ICE has, if you've been seeing on the news, more and more wearing plain clothes, not uniforms, not always identifying themselves. So if you're confronted and you don't know, you can challenge and ask to see an ID. But then I would really encourage you to have one of our folks come out and verify the person is who they say they are.
Right. I think that's right. Thanks, Dave. And that we do know, as Dave mentioned, that we see ICE not always identifying themselves or wearing different clothing or badges that doesn't make it obvious that they are ICE. This is something that ICE does. And so I did answer one of the other questions I typed an answer to, provide a link that has more information from an immigration advocacy group that has explored and has sued ICE about this, actually. And I also want to note that if there is an ICE interaction happening, of course, call CUPD, use the Rafe Guardian app, and get support on campus, as Dave's saying, to ensure that this is actually ICE and that there is an actual warrant, right? In the meantime, you do have the right to film ICE. And so Victor just put a link in the chat to that, but you can record what is going on. You can write down how many officers, what are they wearing, or you can record this. And that's a way of later figuring out how to deal with the situation as well.
So, Dave, I think this question is more for you, and I think it's just a point of clarification, but one of the attendants wanted to know, it is mentioned that CUPD will comply with judicial warrants. Will CUPD comply with administrative warrants?
My apologies if I wasn't clear. No, we will not comply with administrative warrants. We will only honor judicial warrants.
And so it looks like we have several questions to get to, so I'm going to do my best to try and go through them in the time that we have. So someone just asked, can you call someone? Will there a lawyer, CUPD, or such during a ICE encounter? It appears that they can be quite antagonistic from the videos I have seen.
Jerry, are you about to
The
take that
problem
one?
is that that's a difficult question to answer without knowing what it is that ICE already knows about you. So, if all they know is they're asking about who you are, you have a right not to talk to them, and you have a right to make any call you want. If they have probable cause to believe that you have committed a crime, they can stop you from making a phone call right then, although you would have an opportunity later to make a phone call. So the problem is you don't know what they already know or don't know. So, I think there is nothing wrong with trying to do that. But I think the first line is usually to say something like, I need to make a phone call and I want to step away, or can I do that? Because I think the other thing I would really be careful, I would not pull anything out of my pocket without telling them ahead of time that I was doing that, because there could be some assumptions that you were pulling a weapon, and you certainly wouldn't want to give them an excuse to think that.
Thank you, Sherry. Jackie, did you have something to add?
No, that sounds right to me.
Okay. And so then I think this question would be relevant for everyone on the call. Are buildings that have card access only entry considered private? And I know that there's some other questions about whether classrooms are considered public spaces because they're not locked. And so, yeah, this question in particular is just trying to figure out if buildings that have card access only entry are considered private or whether they're considered public.
I'll take a first swipe at that one. If the card access is set where you are required to have a Cornell ID that's authorized to access that space, so you have to touch your card to the reader and then access, that's private space. So we treat that in our everyday interactions as a private building. So if we find somebody that's not authorized in there, we would ask them to leave.
I'm actually happy to hear that because Jackie and I were asking each other that question before, and that's what we assumed was correct. But I would add to that, you do not need, as a student or a faculty member, don't hold the door open for anyone who might be ICE or, there's no reason you need to do that. If it's card entry, you have no obligation to assist ICE in entering.
Sherry, thank you so much for bringing that up. That's why I put that in the weekly message. Some weeks about tailgating, and I have heard anecdotal stories. That's how ICE has accessed buildings. We all want to be friendly. We all want to be helpful, but we've had in other crimes on campus where somebody says, "Hey, hold the door," and we don't want to be mean, but we need to stop doing that. We need to say, "I'm sorry, you got to present your ID and access badge in yourself, please." And not let people that you don't know into a secure area.
I also see a question that's related about what kind of signage should you put on your door to indicate that it's a private space. You could put the word private in all caps and stick that sign on the door, right? If you are not sure or you want to make that very clear. You could add to that. For example, here at the law school, we have a section of the law school that is our clinical law office, and our door says that on there. This is a functioning law office and it is private, right? Come by appointment only kind of thing. So you could add that. This question that I'm seeing is about labs or other workspaces. You could add more, but if it says private, that should be pretty clear.
So we have just about 6 minutes left, and so we still have some questions left in the chat. And if your question was not answered, please message them to me, and I will try to have them answered as quickly as possible. Someone mentioned the possibility of drafting up a document with all these questions and answers, a kind of a FAQ, and so we'll certainly look into potentially doing that. But I wanted to really just provide the presenters an opportunity to leave with some parting thoughts or some parting guidance. I know that we've covered a lot of information and things are constantly changing, but to Dave, Sherry, Jackie, is there anything in particular that you want to make sure that our attendants know as we kind of wrap up the webinar?
Oh, Sherry, you're muted.
I see one question in the chat that I wanted to respond to, which is, if you don't have ICE identification, can you resist? I'm going to say, I think resistance under most circumstances with ICE is a mistake. I think that you can't know what what their suspicions are or what justification they might have. And, to do that is really, especially in the current climate, very, very risky and unlikely to be successful. I think, on the other hand, the opposite part, which is most of what we've been saying, is you have no duty to cooperate. You don't have any duty to cooperate in any way. And there was another question earlier. If you know about a student who's not documented or whose visa has been revoked, do you have to do anything about it? And the answer to that is no. You don't have to do anything. You shouldn't do anything. Official, and being supportive is itself not any kind of felony or crime. Concealing someone can be harboring a fugitive, but you'd have to actually be concealing them to be liable for that.
And I'll pick up a little bit from there. And I think how we can help, as I'm seeing in some of the questions, is good bystander intervention. So I think it's good advice not to resist if it's especially a federal agent, but that doesn't mean bystanders can't call my folks to have them come and just verify these people are who they say they are, and work together. And I just want to close with saying thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate being included and being able to support everything that we're working on here.
So just one final aside to that point, there was a recent case in which an individual who was engaging with immigration was accused of resisting and is now potentially facing, correct me if I'm wrong, Jackie or Sherry, I think up to 20 years in prison, right? And so resisting is generally not advisable, right? And that's just something that I think is important to really think about. And so with that said, I just want to, again, thank our wonderful presenters for taking time out of their day to share this information with us. The recording will be made available to all of you who registered. We'll provide more details about that later on. As far as the questions that were not addressed, again, please do not hesitate to reach out in case you have any additional questions or your question wasn't addressed live. But thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you all soon.